Tonight, we're descending into the criminal underworld of a galaxy far, far away. We're exploring the life of a smuggler, a scoundrel, and ultimately, one of the greatest heroes the rebellion ever knew. This is the story of Han Solo, a man who started with nothing, built himself into a legend through sheer audacity and skill, and then sacrificed everything for the people he loved. His journey takes us from the filthy streets of Corellia to the frozen wastes of Hoth, from the depths of carbonite imprisonment to the forest moon of Endor. But more than that, it's a story about transformation, about how a man who only looked out for himself learned to care about something bigger, about how cynicism gave way to idealism, how isolation gave way to family, how a mercenary became a general. The story of Han Solo is the story of redemption without ever committing a crime that needed redeeming. It's about discovering that you're capable of being more than you thought you were, that the galaxy is bigger than your own survival, and that love matters more than credits. It's about a scruffy-looking nerf herder who changed the fate of the entire galaxy simply by choosing to come back. Let's start where Han Solo started. On the industrial planet Corellia, in the core worlds, in the year 32, before the Battle of Yavin. Corellia was known throughout the galaxy for two things: starships and ace pilots. The shipyards of Corellia produced some of the finest vessels in the galaxy, including Imperial star destroyers and that beat-up piece of junk that would become the fastest hunk of garbage in the galaxy, the Millennium Falcon. But Han Solo didn't grow up in the shipyards with honest work and a steady paycheck. Han grew up on the streets, an orphan with no family, no prospects, no future beyond day-to-day survival. His earliest memories were of hunger, of cold, of learning to steal just to eat. The details of his parents remain murky even to this day. Some accounts suggest his father worked in the Corellian shipyards. Others claim he never knew them at all. What we know for certain is that young Han ended up in the clutches of Lady Proxima, the leader of the White Worms gang. The White Worms operated in the shadows of Corellia, literally. Lady Proxima herself was a Grindalid, a creature that couldn't tolerate sunlight. She ran her criminal empire from the sewers and tunnels beneath Corellia's industrial sectors, using children as her workforce. Han became one of those children. A scrum rat, they called them. Kids who stole and scavenged and ran scams for Lady Proxima in exchange for food and shelter. It was brutal work. The White Worms didn't care about the welfare of their child labourers. You produced or you were discarded. Simple as that. But Han Solo, even as a teenager, possessed something that would define his entire life: audacity, raw, unfiltered confidence that bordered on arrogance. He was good at stealing, better at talking his way out of trouble, and possessed an almost supernatural ability to calculate odds and take risks that seemed insane, but somehow paid off. He also possessed something else, something that would prove even more important in the long run: hope. Despite everything, despite the poverty and the abuse and the utter absence of prospects, Han Solo believed he could escape Corellia, believed he could become a pilot, see the galaxy, live free. That hope kept him alive when cynicism might have been more practical. Around the age of 18 or 19, Han met someone who shared that hope. Her name was Qi'ra, pronounced like Qi'ra. She was another scrum rat working for the White Worms, and she and Han fell in love in the way that young people fall in love when the world is cruel and they only have each other. They dreamed together of escaping Corellia, of finding something better. In 13 before the Battle of Yavin, Han and Qi'ra finally made their move. They'd stolen a vial of coaxium, the refined hyperfuel that powered starship hyperdrives and was worth a small fortune. With that coaxium, they could bribe their way off planet. They could start over somewhere, anywhere that wasn't Corellia. They ran through the industrial wastelands of their homeworld, pursued by Moloch and other enforcers from the White Worms. The chase led them to a spaceport, to a departing transport that represented freedom. Han made it through the Imperial checkpoint. Qi'ra didn't. She was caught by the pursuing White Worms just meters from safety. Han, already through security, faced an impossible choice. Go back and get caught himself, or leave Qi'ra behind and escape alone. He chose escape, but not without a promise. He screamed back to her that he would return, that he would come back for her, that she should wait for him. It was a promise made in desperation and sincerity. A promise that would haunt both of them, shape both of them, define the paths they would each take. But in that moment, Han had to keep moving or lose his chance. He approached the Imperial recruitment station and told them he wanted to be a pilot. The recruitment officer asked for his name. Han gave his first name only. The officer asked about his family, his people. Han, an orphan with no surname and no kin, replied that he had no people, that he was alone. The officer, with bureaucratic efficiency, typed in Han Solo. The name stuck. It would become legendary. But before Han Solo could become a legend, he had to survive the Imperial Academy. He'd joined the Empire with dreams of becoming the galaxy's best pilot, of flying the fastest ships, of proving his natural talent. What he got instead was a harsh education in Imperial discipline, regulations, and the brutal reality of the regime he'd enlisted to serve. The Imperial Academy on Qi'ra was prestigious, training the best pilots the Empire had to offer. Han excelled at the flying portions. His natural ability was undeniable. He could outfly almost anyone, could push ships to their limits and beyond, could make split-second calculations that seemed impossible. But he struggled with everything else. Authority didn't sit well with Han Solo. Never had, never would. The Imperial military demanded absolute obedience, unquestioning loyalty to orders no matter how arbitrary or cruel. Han questioned everything, challenged his superiors, made sarcastic comments when silence would have served him better. He was, in the words of his instructors, insubordinate. 3 years at the academy should have resulted in a commission as an Imperial pilot. Instead, Han was expelled for his attitude and his inability to follow regulations he considered stupid. Worse, his expulsion came with consequences. He was transferred to the Imperial infantry as a mud trooper, essentially a punishment detail for washouts and screw-ups. In 10 before the Battle of Yavin, Han found himself on Mimban. It was a miserable assignment. Mimban was a swamp planet embroiled in a grinding campaign against insurgents, and mud troopers were the lowest of the low. They slogged through endless mud and fought in brutal conditions with minimal support. It was hell. That's where Han met Tobias Beckett. Or rather, that's where Han tried to con Tobias Beckett. Beckett and his crew were posing as Imperial officers, but Han spotted them immediately for the criminals they were. He tried to blackmail his way onto their crew, threatening to expose them if they didn't take him along. Beckett's response was to have Han arrested for desertion and thrown into a pit with a Wookiee prisoner who was meant to kill him. The Wookiee's name was Chewbacca. He'd been captured by the Empire and was starving, half mad with hunger and rage. The troopers threw Han into the pit, expecting entertainment. What they got instead was a surprise. Han Solo spoke Shiriwook, the Wookiee language. It wasn't fluent, but it was enough. In the few moments before Chewbacca would have torn him apart, Han managed to communicate that they could escape together if they worked as a team. Chewbacca, desperate enough to try anything, agreed. They escaped the pit, forced Beckett to take them along, or risk being recaptured themselves. And thus began one of the most legendary partnerships in galactic history. Chewbacca, grateful for Han's quick thinking and impressed by his courage, swore a life debt to the Corellian, a sacred Wookiee tradition that meant Chewie would protect Han with his life until the debt was paid. Han initially wasn't thrilled about having a 2-meter-tall walking carpet as a constant companion. He'd saved Chewbacca partly out of desperation, and partly out of a remnant of decency that Han himself might not have acknowledged. But the life debt meant Chewie wasn't going anywhere. They were stuck with each other. As it turned out, being stuck with Chewbacca was the best thing that ever happened to Han Solo. Chewie became his partner, his friend, his conscience, and eventually his family. But that was still to come. First, they had to survive working with Beckett's crew. Beckett was a thief and a smuggler, but he was also a mentor whether he wanted to be or not. He taught Han lessons about survival in the criminal underworld, about trust being a weakness, about looking out for yourself first, about never making a move unless you'd already calculated 3 moves ahead. These were lessons that would shape how Han Solo operated for years, but Beckett taught Han one other crucial lesson, though it came later, and in a way Beckett never intended. Sometimes the cynical approach gets you killed. Sometimes trust, however dangerous, is necessary. Sometimes caring about something beyond yourself is what saves you. Beckett's crew was planning a heist. They needed to steal coaxium from an Imperial transport on the planet Vandor. Refined coaxium was incredibly valuable and incredibly dangerous, unstable if not properly handled. The job required precision, timing, and a whole lot of luck. It went wrong almost immediately. The transport job turned into a disaster. Members of Beckett's crew were killed. The coaxium was destroyed. And suddenly Beckett owed a massive debt to Dryden Voss, a lieutenant in the Crimson Dawn crime syndicate. Crimson Dawn didn't accept excuses or apologies. They wanted their product, or they wanted blood. Han, trying to salvage the situation and prove himself useful, suggested a new plan. They could steal unrefined coaxium directly from the source, from the spice mines of Kessel. It was audacious to the point of stupidity. Kessel was one of the most heavily guarded locations in the galaxy, and unrefined coaxium was even more volatile than the refined stuff. But it was the only option that didn't end with all of them dead. To pull off a Kessel Run, they needed a fast ship. That led them to Lando Calrissian. Lando was everything Han wanted to be, at least on the surface. Suave, sophisticated, charming, dressed in the finest capes the galaxy had to offer. He owned the Millennium Falcon, a modified YT-1300 light freighter that Lando had customized into something special. Lando was also a gambler and a con artist, though considerably smoother about it than Han. The two recognized each other immediately as kindred spirits and potential rivals. There was instant tension, instant competition. Lando was the polished operator Han aspired to become. Han was the rough-edged scoundrel Lando used to be. They negotiated a deal. Lando would provide the Falcon and his piloting skills in exchange for a cut of the coaxium score. Lando also brought along his droid, L3-37, a self-modified navigational droid with opinions about droid rights and liberation. L3 was Lando's co-pilot and, in ways that Lando himself might not have fully understood, his closest companion. The Kessel heist was chaos from start to finish. They infiltrated the mines, freed the slave laborers which L3 insisted upon, stole the unrefined coaxium, and barely escaped with their lives. L3 was destroyed during the escape, her navigational data salvaged and integrated into the Falcon systems. It was a loss that affected Lando deeply, though he hid it behind his usual swagger. But they had the coaxium, which meant they had to get it to a refinery before it became unstable and exploded. That meant making the Kessel Run, a hyperspace route through the treacherous Maw cluster near Kessel. And it meant doing it fast. This is where Han Solo earned his most famous boast. With the Falcon damaged and the coaxium ticking down to detonation, Han took the pilot's seat and made a desperate gamble. He plotted a shorter route through the Maw, cutting close to gravity wells and black holes, shaving distance off the standard route in ways that should have been impossible. He made the Kessel Run in approximately 12 parsecs. Now, parsecs are units of distance, not time, which has caused endless debate among Star Wars fans. But what Han accomplished was shortening the distance of the run itself through a more direct and dangerous route. It was a display of piloting skill that was absolutely extraordinary, and Han would brag about it for the rest of his life. They delivered the coaxium to the refinery on Savareen. That's where everything went sideways. The mission had been tracked by Enfy's Nest and the Cloud Riders, a group Han had assumed were pirates. It turned out they were something different. They were rebels fighting against the Empire and criminal syndicates like Crimson Dawn. Enfy's Nest explained to Han that giving the coaxium to Dryden Voss meant giving it to the Empire. Crimson Dawn worked for Imperial interests. The fuel would be used to build weapons, to fund military operations, to tighten the Empire's grip on the galaxy. She offered Han an alternative. Join the rebellion, help them, use his skills for something that mattered. Han refused. He wasn't interested in rebellions or causes. He just wanted to get paid, get his ship, and go find Qi'ra like he'd promised. Speaking of Qi'ra, she'd reappeared in Han's life during this whole mess. She'd survived the White Worms, had been enslaved, had fought her way up through Crimson Dawn's ranks to become Dryden Voss's most trusted lieutenant. She and Han had reconnected, but she wasn't the same person he'd left behind on Corellia. The confrontation with Dryden Voss ended in violence. Beckett betrayed them, as Beckett had always known he eventually would. He took the coaxium and ran. Qi'ra killed Dryden to save Han, but then she made a choice Han didn't see coming. She didn't leave with him. Instead, she took Dryden's place in Crimson Dawn, contacted Darth Maul, who was apparently running the organization from the shadows, and sent Han away. It was the second time Han Solo and Qi'ra had been separated by circumstances beyond their control. But this time was different. This time, Qi'ra had chosen to stay behind. She'd been shaped by her years, in Crimson Dawn, in ways Han couldn't fix or save her from. She was too deep in the criminal underworld to escape, or perhaps she no longer wanted to escape. Han pursued Beckett to Savareen's plains, confronted him. Beckett talked, the way Beckett always talked, trying to justify his betrayal and buy time. But Han had learned Beckett's lessons well. Sometimes you shoot first. Sometimes you don't wait for the other person to make their move. Han shot Beckett before he could fully draw his weapon. It was a betrayal of a betrayer, but it still hurt. With Beckett dead and Qi'ra gone, Han was left with Chewbacca, the stolen coaxium, and a choice. He could keep the coaxium, sell it, live comfortably for a while, or he could give it to Enfy's Nest and the rebellion. He chose the rebellion, though he told himself he wasn't joining them, just helping out this once. No commitment. Then Han and Chewie tracked down Lando Calrissian on Numidian Prime. Han had learned to play sabacc during his time with Beckett and Lando, and he'd learned one other important skill, cheating. Lando had been cheating during their earlier games using a rigged card dealing mechanism. Han used the same trick against him. The stakes were simple. If Han won, he got the Millennium Falcon, and Han won. Lando, gracious in defeat at least on the surface, handed over the Falcon's control codes. Han Solo finally had his ship. The fastest hunk of junk in the galaxy. A beat-up, modified, perpetually breaking down freighter that would become more famous than any capital ship in the Imperial fleet. What followed were years of smuggling. Han and Chewie worked the Outer Rim, running spice for Jabba the Hutt, avoiding Imperial entanglements, making a name for themselves. They flew dangerous routes, made impossible escapes, and built a reputation. Han Solo became known as one of the best smugglers in the galaxy. Fast, clever, lucky beyond reason. But luck runs out eventually. During one spice run, Imperial ships appeared where they shouldn't have been. Han had to dump his cargo to avoid being caught with contraband. That cargo belonged to Jabba the Hutt, and Jabba didn't accept excuses. Han now owed Jabba an enormous sum of money, and Jabba put a bounty on his head to encourage prompt payment. This brings us to the year 0 before the Battle of Yavin, the year that changed everything. Han was in Mos Eisley Spaceport on Tatooine, trying to scrounge up enough credits to pay off Jabba. He was desperate enough to take almost any job. That's when he met Ben Kenobi and Luke Skywalker in the cantina. They needed transport to Alderaan, and they had credits. Lots of credits. 17,000 up front, plus an additional 15,000 when they reached Alderaan. It was exactly the kind of score Han needed. Simple transport job, no questions asked, good pay. He took it without hesitation. Before they could leave, Han had a confrontation with Greedo, a bounty hunter working for Jabba. Greedo had tracked Han to the cantina and intended to collect the bounty. What happened next has been debated by Star Wars fans for decades, with various edits of the film showing different versions. But the result was the same. Han shot Greedo and escaped. He then had a meeting with Jabba himself, who'd come to the spaceport personally to collect his debt. Han talked his way into more time, promising to pay Jabba back with interest. Jabba, amused by Han's audacity and still somewhat fond of the Corellian, agreed. But he warned Han that this was his last chance. Next time, there would be no negotiation. The flight to Alderaan should have been routine. It wasn't. First, Imperial stormtroopers tried to stop them at the spaceport. Han outflew them, made the jump to hyperspace, and thought they were safe. Then, they arrived at the coordinates for Alderaan and found nothing but asteroid debris. The Death Star had destroyed Alderaan mere hours earlier. Billions of people, an entire planet, obliterated by the Empire's ultimate weapon. And the Millennium Falcon was caught in the Death Star's tractor beam before Han could jump away. They were pulled aboard the battle station itself. What followed was insanity. Ben Kenobi went to disable the tractor beam. Luke, Han, and Chewbacca ended up rescuing Princess Leia Organa from detention block AA-23. The princess was nothing like Han expected. She was brave, commanding, sharp-tongued, and absolutely unimpressed by Han's attempts at roguish charm. Their rescue attempt went badly almost immediately. Stormtroopers trapped them in the detention area. Leia, frustrated by Han and Luke's lack of a plan, grabbed a blaster and shot open a garbage chute. They escaped into the trash compactor where the walls began closing in to crush them. They barely escaped with their lives. The dynamic between Han and Leia was combative from the first moment. She called him a scoundrel. He called her your worshipfulness with deliberate sarcasm. She was everything Han claimed not to respect. Royalty, idealistic, fighting for a cause instead of herself. He was everything she claimed to despise. Mercenary, cynical, only motivated by money. But beneath the bickering was tension of a different kind. Han was attracted to Leia immediately, though he'd have denied it. Leia was intrigued by Han despite herself, though she'd have denied it even more strenuously. They were opposites who sparked off each other in ways neither fully understood yet. They escaped the Death Star after Ben sacrificed himself in a duel with Darth Vader. Han flew them to the rebel base on Yavin 4, delivered Leia and Luke safely, collected his reward, and prepared to leave. He'd done his job, earned his money, time to pay off Jabba and go back to smuggling. But as he was loading the Falcon, Luke confronted him, pleaded with him to stay, and help with the assault on the Death Star. Han refused. He wasn't a hero. He wasn't joining any rebellion. He was a smuggler, and smugglers looked out for themselves. That's how you survived. Luke left disappointed, and Han left Yavin 4 with Chewbacca and his reward money. They were finally free of Jabba's bounty, free to take any job they wanted, free to live the life Han had always wanted. Except Han Solo discovered something on that flight, away from Yavin 4. Freedom felt hollow. He thought about Luke, a kid who believed in causes and fighting for something bigger than himself. He thought about Leia, who just watched her planet destroyed and was still organizing an attack on the station that did it. He thought about Ben, who'd given his life to help them escape. And somewhere deep inside, beneath all the cynicism and self-preservation, Han Solo discovered he had a conscience. The Battle of Yavin was underway. Rebel fighters were attacking the Death Star, trying to exploit a tiny weakness in its defenses. The Empire was picking them off methodically. Luke was making his attack run, lining up the shot that could destroy the entire station. And Darth Vader was on his tail, about to shoot him down. Then the Millennium Falcon appeared out of nowhere. Han had come back. He'd abandoned his payment run to Tatooine, had convinced Chewbacca to turn around, and had arrived at the battle just in time to save Luke's life. His shot scattered Vader's fighter escort. The surprise attack knocked Vader's ship spinning into space. Luke made the shot. The Death Star exploded. The rebellion won its first major victory against the Empire. And Han Solo, the smuggler who only looked out for himself, became a hero of the rebellion. Not because he joined their cause or started believing in their ideals, but because when his friends needed him, he couldn't leave them to die. The medal ceremony afterward was revealing. Luke and Han received medals from Leia for their heroism. Han looked uncomfortable the entire time, not used to formal recognition or public honor. But when Leia placed the medal around his neck, their eyes met, and something passed between them. Something neither was ready to acknowledge yet. What followed were 3 years of service to the rebellion. Han stayed. He told himself it was temporary, that he'd leave once he'd helped a bit more, that he wasn't really committed to the cause. But he stayed anyway, running missions, transporting supplies, fighting the Empire, and he developed relationships that mattered. Luke became his best friend. They had an easy camaraderie built on mutual respect and the shared trauma of their adventures. Luke brought out something decent in Han, made him want to be better than he thought he was. Han brought out confidence in Luke, taught him practical skills to complement his Jedi training. And then there was Leia, the princess who drove him crazy with her commanding attitude and absolute certainty. The woman who could infuriate him with a single glance and who challenged him constantly. Their relationship remained combative on the surface, but underneath, something was growing that neither wanted to name. By 3. After the Battle of Yavin, the rebellion had established a base on the ice planet Hoth. Han had risen to the rank of captain and was leading missions. He was respected, valued, a key part of the command structure. But he was also restless. The bounty from Jabba remained on his head, with interest accumulating. He needed to finally deal with that debt. Han announced he was leaving, going to Tatooine to pay off Jabba once and for all. It was the practical decision, the smart decision. But it meant leaving the rebellion, leaving Luke, and leaving Leia. The announcement created tension throughout Echo Base. Luke was disappointed but understanding. Leia was furious, though she tried to hide it behind professional coolness. Han and Leia had several confrontations in the Hoth base, dancing around feelings neither would admit. He accused her of wanting him to stay for personal reasons. She insisted it was only because he was useful to the rebellion. Then Luke went missing during a patrol, caught in a blizzard. Han, despite his stated plans to leave, went out alone into the freezing Hoth night to find him. He discovered Luke hypothermic and barely conscious after an attack by a wampa. In a desperate move to keep Luke warm, Han used Luke's lightsaber to slice open his tauntaun and put Luke inside the carcass until rescue arrived. It was a brutal, disgusting, practical bit of survival that saved Luke's life. It was also revealing. Han Solo, who claimed to only look out for himself, had risked death in a Hoth blizzard to save his friend. The cynical mercenary persona was increasingly hard to maintain when his actions kept contradicting it. Before Han could actually leave Hoth, the Empire found them. The Battle of Hoth was a disaster for the rebellion. Imperial AT-AT walkers assaulted the base. The rebels had to evacuate. Han's departure to Tatooine was postponed by necessity. He evacuated Leia, Chewie, and C-3PO on the Millennium Falcon, while Luke went separately. The Falcon's hyperdrive was damaged. Han couldn't jump to light speed. Imperial Star Destroyers pursued them, and Han had to pull every trick he knew to escape. He flew into an asteroid field, which Leia insisted was suicide. Han informed her that the odds of successfully navigating an asteroid field were approximately 3,720 to 1. Never tell him the odds. Han hid the Falcon by attaching it to the back of a Star Destroyer where their sensors wouldn't detect it. When the Imperial fleet dumped its garbage before jumping to hyperspace, the Falcon detached and floated away with the debris. It was brilliant and desperate and exactly the kind of insane plan that defined Han Solo's piloting. With the hyperdrive still offline, Han headed to Bespin, to Cloud City, where his old friend Lando Calrissian was now administrator. Lando had apparently gone semi-legitimate, running a Tabana gas mining facility. Han figured they could hide there, get the Falcon repaired, and then figure out their next move. The journey to Bespin was revealing in other ways. Confined together on the Falcon with nowhere to go, and nothing to do but make repairs, Han and Leia finally started being honest with each other. The bickering continued, but the underlying attraction became impossible to ignore. In the belly of a space slug they'd accidentally flown into, thinking it was a cave, Han and Leia had their first kiss. It was awkward, started with Han teaching Leia about the Falcon's systems, and ended with them in each other's arms. Then C-3PO interrupted, and they sprang apart, both pretending it hadn't meant anything, but it had meant something. For Leia, it was terrifying. She was falling for a smuggler who could leave at any moment. For Han, it was equally terrifying. He was falling for a princess who represented everything he'd claimed to reject: duty, sacrifice, idealism. Neither knew how to handle what they were feeling. They arrived at Cloud City to find Lando welcoming and charming as always. He greeted them warmly, flirted with Leia, and offered to help with repairs. Everything seemed fine until Han realized it was a trap. Lando had betrayed them to the Empire. Darth Vader was there. The Empire had arrived before them and had forced Lando to cooperate. Han, Leia, and Chewie were captured. Vader tortured Han, not for information, but to cause Luke pain through their friendship and draw the young Jedi to Bespin. When Luke didn't appear immediately, Vader decided to test the carbon freezing chamber they'd prepared for Luke by using it on Han instead. The carbon freezing chamber was designed for industrial purposes, and no one knew if a human could survive the process. Vader didn't particularly care. If Han died, he died. If he survived, he'd be delivered to Jabba the Hutt to satisfy the bounty and collect some credits for Vader's trouble. As Han was about to be lowered into the chamber, Leia finally said what she'd been unable to say. In front of everyone, with no escape and no hope, she told Han Solo that she loved him. It was the admission neither had been willing to make. The vulnerability neither had wanted to show. Han's response wasn't, "I love you too." Han, being Han, said, "I know." Two words that somehow conveyed everything. Acknowledgement, acceptance, reassurance, and affection, all compressed into an almost casual phrase that nevertheless carried enormous weight. It was the most Han Solo thing he could have said in that moment. The carbonite freezing process was agonizing. Han's face froze in an expression of pain as the metal encased him. The slab was lifted up, examined. Vader asked if he survived. The technician confirmed Solo was alive and in perfect hibernation. They handed the carbonite slab to Boba Fett, who loaded it onto his ship Slave Y and departed for Tatooine. For the next year, Han Solo existed in a state of suspended animation, frozen in carbonite, displayed as a decoration on Jabba's palace wall. He was conscious but immobile, aware but helpless. It was a living nightmare that seemed like it would never end. Meanwhile, his friends were planning his rescue. Luke had continued his Jedi training with Yoda on Dagobah. Leia was coordinating rebel operations and trying to track down where Boba Fett had taken Han. Lando, racked with guilt over his betrayal, had joined the rebellion and was helping plan the rescue mission. The rescue of Han Solo was a complex operation that took months to arrange. Lando infiltrated Jabba's palace, disguised as a guard. Luke crafted a new lightsaber to replace the one he'd lost on Bespin. Leia learned how to reverse the carbon freezing process. They sent C-3PO and R2-D2 as gifts to Jabba, planting key operatives inside the palace. Then Leia, disguised as the bounty hunter Boushh, arrived with Chewbacca as a captured prisoner to claim a bounty. The disguise worked. Jabba accepted the deal. And that night, Leia crept into the throne room and unfroze Han from the carbonite. Han woke up blind and disoriented. Hibernation sickness had damaged his vision temporarily. He didn't know where he was or who had freed him. Leia, still disguised as Boushh, told him someone who loved him. Han, even blind and terrified, asked if it was her. They kissed as the carbonite fell away. Then Jabba's laughter echoed through the chamber. The Hutt had known about the rescue attempt and had let it proceed just to capture Leia as well. Han was thrown in a cell with Chewbacca. Leia was enslaved and chained to Jabba's throne, forced to wear a metal bikini as his personal property. Luke's subsequent arrival and capture meant all the heroes were now prisoners. Jabba sentenced Han and Luke to death by Sarlacc. They would be taken to the great pit of Carkoon and fed to a creature that would digest them slowly over 1,000 years. It was a horrible way to die. Torture extended across centuries. Jabba, the Hutt who'd given Han so many chances, had finally run out of patience. At the pit of Carkoon, the rescue plan finally came together. R2-D2 had Luke's lightsaber hidden in his dome. Luke retrieved it and began fighting Jabba's guards. In the chaos, Han, still partially blind, accidentally triggered Boba Fett's jetpack with the shaft of a weapon, sending the bounty hunter tumbling into the Sarlacc. On the sail barge, Leia strangled Jabba with the chain he'd used to enslave her. The symbol of her captivity became the weapon of her liberation and Jabba's death. The Hutt who terrorized Han for years died at the hands of the woman Han loved. It was poetic in its way. They escaped the barge as it exploded. Han's vision was recovering. They reunited with the fleet. Han Solo was finally, truly free. No bounty on his head. No debts hanging over him. He could have left the rebellion then, could have returned to smuggling with no obligations. He stayed anyway. The rebellion promoted Han to general. It should have been absurd. A former smuggler who'd joined by accident, who'd spent years claiming he didn't care about the cause, now leading troops. But Han had proven himself time and again. He understood tactics. He could improvise. He could inspire loyalty in his troops. He was, despite his protests, a natural leader. The mission to destroy the second Death Star required someone to lead a strike team to the forest moon of Endor to destroy the shield generator protecting the battle station. Han volunteered. He took Luke, Leia, Chewie, and a team of rebel commandos. It was a suicide mission with almost no chance of success. The old Han Solo would never have volunteered for something like this. But Han Solo wasn't that person anymore. On Endor, everything went wrong immediately. The Empire knew they were coming. The strike team was captured by Imperial forces. They escaped with help from the Ewoks, the indigenous species of the forest moon, but the mission seemed doomed. The shield generator was heavily defended. The fleet would arrive expecting the shield to be down, and they'd fly into a trap. Han had to improvise. It's what he did best. With help from the Ewoks, who'd adopted the rebels as allies after C-3PO convinced them he was a god, Han launched an assault on the shield generator bunker. The battle was chaotic. Ewoks with primitive weapons fighting Imperial stormtroopers with blasters and armor. It should have been a massacre. But the Ewoks had home field advantage and guerrilla tactics. They used log traps, rolling boulders, hang glider attacks. The Imperial forces were overwhelmed by enemies they'd underestimated. Han led his commandos into the bunker and planted charges on the reactor. The shield generator exploded just as the space battle reached its critical point. Above Endor, the Rebel fleet engaged the Imperial fleet and the Death Star itself. Lando Calrissian piloted the Millennium Falcon into the Death Star's superstructure with Wedge Antilles. They destroyed the main reactor. The battle station exploded in a cascade of destruction that could be seen from the surface of Endor. The Empire had fallen. Emperor Palpatine was dead, killed by Darth Vader in the throne room. Vader himself had died, redeemed at the last moment by his son Luke. The second Death Star was destroyed. The Imperial fleet was scattered and broken. After decades of tyranny, the galaxy was finally free. Han Solo celebrated with the rebels and the Ewoks around massive bonfires. He'd survived impossible odds again, had helped save the galaxy, had gone from smuggler to general to hero of the rebellion. Luke was there, having returned from cremating his father's body. Leia was there, having just learned the truth about her parentage and her connection to Luke through the Force. Han and Leia's relationship had survived carbonite, enslavement, and galactic war. They were together, truly together, for the first time without crisis or separation hanging over them. The future was open. The galaxy was rebuilding. And Han Solo, the orphan from Corellia who'd only ever looked out for himself, had found something worth living for beyond survival. What followed was a period of rebuilding. The new republic formed from the ashes of the rebellion. Mon Mothma became chief of state. Leia became one of the new government's most important senators. Han struggled with peacetime in ways he'd never struggled with war. He wasn't built for politics or bureaucracy. He needed action, needed purpose beyond diplomatic meetings. Han and Leia married 5 years after the Battle of Endor. It was a small ceremony by royal standards, attended by close friends. Luke officiated. Chewbacca was best man. It should have been the beginning of a peaceful life together. Instead, it was the beginning of new challenges, neither fully anticipated. Leia threw herself into building the new republic. Han supported her, but felt increasingly out of place in the political world she inhabited. He returned to what he knew: piloting, running cargo, occasionally skirting the edges of legality in ways that made Leia frustrated. He wasn't a criminal anymore, but he wasn't quite respectable either. Then they had a son, Ben Solo, named after Ben Kenobi, the old Jedi who'd set all of this in motion. Han was terrified of fatherhood. He'd never had a father himself, had grown up on the streets with no positive role models. He had no idea how to raise a child, especially a child who showed signs of force sensitivity from an early age. Ben was powerful, unnaturally powerful. He could move objects without touching them. He could sense emotions in ways that disturbed him. The Force ran strong in the Skywalker bloodline, and Ben had inherited that power through his mother. It frightened Han, who understood starships and blasters, but had no frame of reference for mystical energy fields. Luke offered to train Ben when the boy reached adolescence, to teach him the ways of the Jedi, help him control his abilities. Han and Leia agreed, despite their reservations. It seemed like the best option. Ben needed guidance that neither of them could provide. Luke had rebuilt the Jedi Order, had taken on students. He could help Ben. It was a decision that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Ben Solo went to train with Luke and the other students. And something went wrong. The details remain murky, coloured by guilt and trauma and conflicting accounts. But the result was clear. Ben fell to the dark side. Luke's Jedi temple was destroyed. Most of the students were killed. Ben Solo vanished. And he re-emerged as Kylo Ren, apprentice to Supreme Leader Snoke of the First Order. The First Order was the remnant of the Empire, reorganized and militarized, operating from the unknown regions and planning to reclaim the galaxy. The loss of Ben destroyed Han and Leia's marriage. Not immediately, not dramatically, but slowly, like carbonite creeping over living tissue. They blamed themselves. They blamed each other. They blamed Luke. The pain was too much to share, so they stopped sharing anything. Leia threw herself deeper into politics, helping form the resistance when the New Republic refused to acknowledge the First Order threat. Han went back to smuggling, to running cargo, to the life he'd known before the rebellion. He and Chewie took jobs throughout the Outer Rim. Dangerous jobs, stupid jobs. Anything to avoid sitting still and thinking about his son. They separated, but never formally divorced. The love was still there, buried under layers of grief and guilt. But they couldn't be together, couldn't look at each other without seeing the child they'd failed to save. It was tragic in ways that no Imperial weapon could have achieved. The war had ended, but they'd lost anyway. For years, Han Solo drifted. He was in his 60s now, still flying the Millennium Falcon, still running from his problems. The legendary smuggler had become a sad, aging man, trying to recapture the glory days when things were simpler, when the enemy was external, when you could blow up a Death Star and solve your problems. He took jobs that were beneath him, hauling Rathtars, dangerous creatures he couldn't properly contain, borrowing money from criminal gangs he couldn't pay back, losing the Millennium Falcon to various parties through bad deals and having to steal it back. His life had become a series of schemes that went wrong and desperate escapes. Then, in 34, after the Battle of Yavin, Han and Chewie detected the Falcon's signal. Someone had stolen it again and was flying it off Jakku. They tracked it down and boarded, expecting to find thieves they could quickly dispatch. Instead, they found Rey and Finn, two young people caught up in events far bigger than themselves. Rey was a scavenger from Jakku with no family and no past she could remember. Finn was a stormtrooper who'd defected from the First Order after his first combat mission. They had BB-8, a droid carrying a map to Luke Skywalker's location. The Resistance needed that map. The First Order wanted it, and these kids were in way over their heads. Han recognized something in Rey immediately. Her mechanical aptitude, her piloting instincts, her desperate need to prove herself. She reminded him of himself at that age. She even called the Falcon garbage, just like Leia had decades ago. There was a connection there, immediate and powerful. What followed was chaos. Han's creditors caught up with him. Rey cleverly released the Rathtars to create a diversion. They escaped to Takodana to Maz Kanata's castle, where Han hoped to find help getting BB-8 to the Resistance. Maz, an ancient pirate who'd known Han for decades, saw through him immediately. She told Han he'd been running from his family for too long, that the belonging he sought wasn't behind him with his glory days, but ahead of him with his son. She offered him Luke's old lightsaber, which had called to Rey through the Force. Han refused. He wanted nothing to do with Jedi weapons or Force destiny. He'd seen where that led. Then the First Order attacked Takodana. Kylo Ren was there, leading stormtroopers to capture the droid and its map. Rey was taken. Finn tried to fight with Luke's lightsaber, but was outmatched. The Resistance arrived with X-Wings, driving off the First Order forces, and Leia was there. Han and Leia saw each other for the first time in years. The reunion was complicated. There was love, still obvious after everything. But there was also pain, guilt, all the unresolved trauma of losing Ben. They didn't know how to talk to each other anymore. Too much had been said, too much left unsaid. But they had a crisis that required putting aside their personal issues. The First Order had built Starkiller Base, a weapon that made the Death Stars look primitive. It was a planet converted into a superweapon that could destroy entire star systems. It had already annihilated the Hosnian system, wiping out the New Republic's capital and fleet in a single strike. The Resistance had to destroy Starkiller Base before it destroyed them. And to do that, they needed to disable its shields. That meant Han Solo going on another suicide mission, leading another strike team against impossible odds. Some things never changed. Finn provided intelligence about the base's layout. He'd worked there as a stormtrooper, knew the systems. The plan was to infiltrate, disable the shields, and give the Resistance fighter squadrons a chance to bomb the thermal oscillator, the weapon's critical weakness. It was desperate and unlikely to work, but it was all they had. Han took Finn and Chewbacca with him. They flew the Falcon through the planet's shields at light speed, a maneuver that should have been impossible and was absolutely insane. Classic Han Solo. They crashed on the planet's snowy surface and infiltrated the base. The mission went well initially. They planted charges, disabled sections of the shield. But then Han saw something that changed everything. He saw Ben, his son. Kylo Ren was on the base, and Han couldn't let this opportunity pass. He couldn't leave without trying one more time to reach the boy he'd lost. Leia had asked Han to bring their son home. It was the conversation they'd avoided for years, finally had in brief sentences heavy with meaning. She still believed Ben could be saved. Han wasn't sure, but he had to try. For Leia, for Ben, for himself. Han approached Kylo Ren on a bridge spanning a massive chasm within the base. He called out to his son, not as a general or a hero, but as a father. He said Ben's name, the name Kylo had abandoned. He told Ben to take off the mask, to look at him. Kylo removed his helmet. Beneath it was the face of their son, older but recognizable, conflicted and in pain. Han told Ben he wanted to help, that his mother wanted him home, that they loved him and it wasn't too late. He reached out, offering Ben a chance to return from the dark side. Ben seemed to waver. He said he was being torn apart, that he knew what he had to do but didn't know if he had the strength to do it. He asked for Han's help. Han, desperate to believe his son could be saved, stepped closer. Ben handed him his lightsaber. It seemed like surrender, like acknowledgement, like the beginning of redemption. Han took the weapon, relief flooding through him. The sun was setting, the light draining from Starkiller Base as it prepared to fire again. Shadows fell across the bridge. Then Ben ignited the lightsaber while Han still held it. The blade pierced Han's chest. Father and son stood frozen for a moment, both impaled by the weapon Han had taken as a sign of hope. Ben had asked for help killing Han Solo. not help returning to the light. He'd needed his father's strength to commit the act that would secure his place in the dark side. Han Solo touched his son's face. Even dying, even betrayed, he reached out with love. Then Ben withdrew the blade. Han staggered backward, wounded mortally. He fell from the bridge into the chasm below, tumbling into darkness as Chewbacca screamed in anguish above. The death of Han Solo accomplished what Ben Solo hoped it would. It severed his connection to the light. It proved his commitment to the dark side. It demonstrated to Snoke that Kylo Ren could be trusted. But it didn't eliminate the conflict Ben felt. If anything, it intensified it. For Leia, the death of Han was felt immediately through the Force. Across the galaxy, she sensed the moment he died. The man she'd loved, had married, had built a life with, was gone. Killed by the son they'd created together. The tragedy was complete. Chewbacca, who'd known Han for over 30 years, who'd sworn a life debt to him, who'd been his partner and friend and brother, avenged Han immediately. He detonated the charges they planted, crippling Starkiller Base and giving the Resistance fighters their chance. But no amount of destruction could bring Han back. The Millennium Falcon escaped with Finn and Rey. Resistance fighters destroyed the thermal oscillator. Starkiller Base was torn apart from within, the planet cracking and exploding. It was a victory. The First Order's superweapon was destroyed, but the cost was devastating. Han Solo's body fell into the chasm of a disintegrating planet. There was no funeral, no body to bury. He simply ceased to exist, consumed by the same energy that had powered the weapon he'd helped destroy. It was an ending with no ceremony, no gravestone, no marker. The legendary smuggler vanished as if he'd never existed, but his impact remained. Rey, who'd known Han for only days, carried his influence forward. She took up the fight against the First Order with a determination shaped by Han's example. Finn continued the mission Han had died trying to complete. Chewbacca kept flying the Falcon, kept fighting because that's what Han would have wanted. And Leia. Leia continued leading the Resistance despite her grief. She'd lost her home planet, her father figures, her brother's presence, her son to darkness, and now her husband. She'd lost everything except the cause she'd dedicated her life to. She kept fighting because giving up would have meant Han died for nothing. The legacy of Han Solo extended beyond his death. He'd been a hero of the rebellion, a general of the Alliance, a key figure in defeating the Empire. His piloting skills were legendary. The Kessel Run in 12 parsecs became the stuff of mythology. The Millennium Falcon itself became a symbol of rebellion and freedom. But his real legacy was in the people he'd changed. Luke Skywalker might never have destroyed the Death Star if Han hadn't come back at the crucial moment. Leia might never have found love if Han hadn't been persistently, annoyingly charming. Chewbacca found a brother and partner. Lando found redemption through friendship with Han. Even in death, Han Solo influenced the galaxy. Rey took inspiration from the scoundrel who'd shown her kindness. Kylo Ren was haunted by the murder of his father, the act that was supposed to free him from conflict, instead intensifying it. The memory of Han Solo became a reminder of what the Resistance was fighting for. A year after Han's death, Rey confronted Kylo Ren on the ruins of the second Death Star. The Emperor had returned somehow, commanding the First Order from the shadows. The war that Han had fought in decades ago had never truly ended. The cycle of darkness and light continued. During that confrontation, Leia reached out through the Force to her son. She used the last of her strength to call to Ben, to remind him who he'd been before he became Kylo Ren. The effort killed her. Leia Organa died reaching for her son, hoping he could still be saved. The moment Leia died, Ben Solo felt it across the galaxy. His mother's death broke something in him that his father's death had only cracked. And in that moment, Han Solo appeared to him, not as a Force ghost. Han had no connection to the Force, but as a memory, a vision, a manifestation of Ben's guilt and his lingering love for his father. The vision of Han repeated the conversation they'd had on Starkiller Base. But this time, when Ben said he knew what he had to do but didn't have the strength, Han told him he did. The vision of Han Solo gave Ben permission to return to the light, told him it was never too late. It was the absolution Ben had needed for years. Ben Solo threw away his Kylo Ren lightsaber, cast it into the ocean like the symbol of evil it had become. He'd killed Han Solo as Kylo Ren, but he'd been redeemed by the memory of Han Solo as Ben. The father he'd murdered had, in a sense, saved him. Ben joined Rey in the final battle against Emperor Palpatine. He gave his life to resurrect Rey after Palpatine killed her, transferring his life force to her through the Force. It was the ultimate act of selflessness, echoing the sacrifice his father had tried to teach him. Ben Solo died redeemed, returning to the light side at the cost of his own life. The war ended. The Sith were defeated. The First Order collapsed. The galaxy began rebuilding for the third time in living memory. And Han Solo's influence continued echoing through those who'd known him, those he'd saved, those he'd inspired. Rey took the name Skywalker to honor the family that had adopted her. She visited Tatooine, looked out over the twin suns, and buried the lightsabers of Luke and Leia in the sand. When a passerby asked her name, she identified herself as Rey Skywalker. The legacy continued. The story of Han Solo is ultimately about transformation, about a man who started with nothing and built himself into a legend, not through power or birthright, but through skill, courage, and the willingness to show up when it mattered. He wasn't special in the way Jedi were special. He couldn't use the Force. He wasn't chosen by destiny. Han Solo was just a guy. A really good pilot with a fast ship and more luck than anyone had a right to. He made mistakes constantly. He was cocky, sometimes reckless, occasionally stupid. He got frozen in carbonite because he couldn't pay his debts. He lost his son to darkness. He died trying to save that son and failed. But he was also heroic in ways that mattered more than destroying battle stations. He came back for Luke at Yavin when he could have run. He went into a blizzard to save his friend. He led suicide missions repeatedly. He loved Leia with a depth that surprised him. He tried to be a father despite having no idea how. The transformation from smuggler to hero wasn't instantaneous. It was gradual, happening over decades through countless small choices. Each time Han chose to help instead of run, he became a little less cynical. Each time he chose friendship over profit, he became a little more connected. Each time he chose to stay instead of leave, he became a little more committed to something beyond himself. By the end, Han Solo was a completely different person than the man who'd walked into that cantina in Mos Eisley. He'd gone from being alone to having a family, from caring only about money to fighting for a cause, from running from commitment to dying while trying to save his son. The journey was the point. His relationship with Chewbacca exemplified this transformation. It started as obligation, a life debt Han hadn't asked for. It became partnership, two people working together because they functioned well as a team. And it ended as brotherhood, family chosen rather than inherited. When Han died, Chewbacca didn't consider the life debt paid. The debt had transcended its origins into something deeper. Han and Leia's relationship was equally transformative. They brought out the best in each other, challenged each other, made each other better. Leia learned to be less rigid, to trust her feelings. Han learned to be less selfish, to care about causes larger than himself. They were opposites who became complementary. The tragedy of losing Ben to darkness nearly destroyed what they built. But even separated by grief, they never stopped loving each other. Leia's last request was for Han to bring their son home. Han's last act was trying to fulfill that request. Their love survived everything except time. Han's death on Starkiller Base was controversial among fans. Some felt it was the right end for a character who'd always taken ridiculous risks. Others felt it was unnecessarily tragic, robbing Han of the peaceful retirement he'd earned. But in context, it was perfectly in character. Han Solo died doing what he'd always done, taking an impossible chance on a desperate hope. He gambled that he could reach his son, that love could overcome darkness. He lost that gamble, but the attempt itself was heroic. The old Han Solo would never have tried. The transformed Han Solo couldn't not try. The fact that his death ultimately contributed to Ben's redemption gives it meaning. Han died believing he'd failed. But his final act of reaching out with love, of touching his son's face even while dying, planted seeds that eventually grew into Ben's return to the light. The sacrifice mattered, even though Han never knew it. There's something deeply human about Han Solo that made him relatable in ways that Jedi and Sith could never be. He didn't have special powers. He couldn't see the future or move objects with his mind. He was just extremely good at what he did, which was flying ships and shooting first and making improbable escapes. His dialogue became iconic because it sounded like how people actually talk. When faced with impossible odds, he said, "Never tell him the odds." When Leia said she loved him, he said, "I know." When things went wrong, he had a bad feeling about this. His lines felt natural, unforced, real, in a way that elevated the entire saga. The Millennium Falcon became inseparable from Han's identity. That ship was an extension of who he was. Beat up, unreliable, underestimated, but capable of incredible things when pushed. Han poured his personality into that ship through modifications and repairs and endless tinkering. It was his home in ways no planet ever was. Losing the Falcon repeatedly after Ben's fall symbolized how far Han had declined. He kept losing the thing that mattered most, kept having to steal it back, kept making bad deals that cost him his ship. It represented his loss of control over his own life, his inability to hold on to anything that mattered. When Rey flew the Falcon after Han's death, she flew with Han's spirit. His tricks, his modifications, his attitude toward the ship as something alive that needed coaxing and cursing in equal measure. The Falcon survived him and carried his legacy forward. It was fitting. Han's relationship with Luke is often overlooked but was foundational to both characters. Luke represented everything Han claimed to reject. Idealism, mysticism, faith in the goodness of people. But Han couldn't help liking Luke, couldn't help wanting to protect him. Their friendship was built on genuine affection despite their differences. When Luke needed someone to believe in him, Han was there. When Han needed someone to bring out his better nature, Luke was there. They balanced each other. Luke made Han more idealistic. Han made Luke more practical. Together, they were better than either was alone. The fact that Han trusted Luke to train Ben speaks to the depth of that friendship. Han had no understanding of the Force and actively disbelieved in it for years. But he trusted Luke with his son's life. That trust was betrayed not through malice, but through tragedy, which somehow made it worse. Han's criminal past never fully left him. Even as a general of the rebellion, even married to royalty, he remained a smuggler at heart. He understood criminal psychology. He could negotiate with Hutts and gang leaders. He knew how the underworld operated because he'd lived there most of his life. This made him uniquely valuable to the rebellion and later the resistance. Han could go places and do things that respectable people couldn't. He could make deals that horrified diplomats. He could think like a criminal to predict what enemies would do. His checkered past was an asset rather than a liability. But it also meant he never fully fit into polite society. The Senate meetings and diplomatic functions that Leia navigated effortlessly made Han uncomfortable. He was a man of action forced into a world of words. After the war ended and the rebellion became a government, Han found himself increasingly out of place. That's part of why he returned to smuggling after losing Ben. It wasn't just grief driving him away from Leia, it was also the relief of returning to something he understood. Cargo runs and criminal contacts were familiar in ways that parenthood and politics never were. He was running from pain toward comfort. The theme of fatherhood runs through Han's story in complicated ways. He never knew his own father. He had no model for what a father should be. Victor Creel murdered his family. Anakin Skywalker became Darth Vader. The Star Wars saga is full of terrible fathers, and Han was terrified of becoming another one. His fear was self-fulfilling in ways he never intended. By sending Ben away to Luke, by prioritizing the mission over family, by not knowing how to connect with a Force-sensitive son, Han failed in the ways he most feared. He wasn't abusive or evil. He was simply absent when Ben needed him most. The tragedy is that Han loved his son deeply. He just didn't know how to show it in ways Ben could receive. Han showed love through actions, protecting, providing, teaching practical skills. Ben needed emotional connection, understanding, validation. They spoke different languages of love and neither knew how to translate. Han's attempt to save Ben on Starkiller Base was about redemption for both of them. Han needed to prove he could be the father Ben deserved. Ben needed to prove he could be strong enough to choose the dark side completely. Both failed in their objectives, which created the conditions for eventual redemption. The question of whether Han Solo was a good person is more complex than it seems. He was selfish and mercenary for much of his life. He smuggled illegal goods for criminal organizations. He shot people who got in his way. He abandoned jobs when they became too dangerous. By many measures, he was not a good person. But he was also capable of extraordinary courage and selflessness. He saved Luke's life repeatedly. He loved Leia completely. He tried to save his son at the cost of his own life. He fought for freedom and justice despite having no personal stake in the outcome initially. He inspired loyalty in everyone who knew him well. Perhaps good and bad aren't the right categories for Han Solo. He was complicated, flawed, human in ways that made him relatable. He made selfish choices and heroic choices often in the same day. He contained multitudes. He grew and regressed and grew again. He was, in short, real. The cultural impact of Han Solo extends far beyond the Star Wars films. He became the template for the roguish hero with a heart of gold. The sarcastic smuggler who seems selfish but comes through when it matters. That character archetype appears across science fiction and fantasy because Han Solo defined it so perfectly. Harrison Ford's performance created a character who felt lived in from the first moment. Han wasn't a pristine hero. He was tired, cynical, practical. He'd seen the galaxy's worst, and it had shaped him. Ford brought depth to dialogue that could have been one-dimensional in less capable hands. The famous improvisation of "I know" in response to "I love you" exemplified Ford's understanding of the character. The script called for Han to respond in kind. But Ford recognized that Han would never say something that conventional in that moment. "I know" was perfect, capturing Han's personality in 2 words. Han Solo's story resonates because it's fundamentally about choice. He wasn't destined for heroism. He wasn't chosen by prophecy or gifted with special powers. He was a regular person who kept choosing to do difficult things for reasons he couldn't always articulate. The heroism came from the choices, not from any inherent greatness. Every time Han faced a decision between running away and staying to fight, he made the hard choice. Every time he could have prioritized himself over others, he eventually chose others. It wasn't easy for him. It went against his nature and his training, but he did it anyway. That's what makes his story inspirational. It suggests that heroism is available to anyone willing to make hard choices repeatedly. You don't need special powers or noble birth. You just need to care about something more than your own safety. You need to believe that your actions matter. The relationship between Han Solo and the Force is fascinating. He didn't believe in it for years, dismissing it as hokey religions and ancient weapons. His skepticism made sense. The Jedi were gone, their temple destroyed, their legacy reduced to myth. Why would a practical person believe in mystical energy fields? But Han gradually came to accept the Force's reality, even if he couldn't use it. He saw Luke and Leia do impossible things. He witnessed power that couldn't be explained by skill or luck alone. His disbelief shifted to acceptance. He didn't need to understand the Force to respect its existence. In death, Han influenced events through the Force without being Force-sensitive himself. His memory, his impact on his son, the love he'd shown, all of it mattered in Ben's redemption. The Force works through connections between people. Han's connection to his son transcended death through those connections. The evolution of Han's relationship with Leia is one of the great romance arcs in cinema. They started as antagonists who couldn't stand each other. The bickering, masked attraction neither wanted to acknowledge. The kiss in the asteroid field was their first admission that something existed between them. The carbonite freezing forced them to be honest. No more pretending. No more hiding behind sarcasm. Leia said she loved him. Han acknowledged that he knew. It was the most vulnerable moment either had experienced, stripped of all defenses and pretenses. Their post-rescue relationship had to navigate new territory. They'd admitted their feelings. Now they had to figure out what that meant. Marriage, partnership, building a life together. It was complicated by their vastly different backgrounds and responsibilities. Princess and smuggler, senator and pilot, royalty and commoner. But they made it work for years, found ways to balance their differences, supported each other through the difficulties of building a new government, created a child together, built something real and lasting. Until Ben's fall shattered it all. The separation wasn't about lost love. It was about shared trauma they couldn't process together. Every time they looked at each other, they saw their failure as parents. The pain was too immediate, too raw. They needed distance to survive it. But the love never disappeared. Han's final mission to Starkiller Base was his last gift to Leia. She'd asked him to bring Ben home. Han knew it was probably impossible, knew he'd likely die trying. But he tried anyway because Leia asked, because he still loved her, because maybe, just maybe, he could give her back their son. The question of Han Solo's place in the Force remains open to interpretation. He wasn't Force-sensitive in life, but his influence continued after death in ways that mattered. The vision of Han that Ben saw was more than mere memory. It carried weight, offered redemption, facilitated change. Whether that vision was the Force itself taking Han's shape to reach Ben, or whether it was purely Ben's mind creating what he needed, doesn't diminish its impact. Han Solo saved his son after death in ways he couldn't in life. The love transcended mortality. The political context of Han's life is important to understanding his journey. He came of age during the height of Imperial power. The republic he might have believed in had been replaced by tyranny. Freedom was a distant memory. The galaxy was controlled by fear and military might. Han's cynicism made sense in that context. Why fight for freedom when the fight seemed hopeless? Why risk everything for a cause that would probably fail? Better to look out for yourself, make money, survive. The cynical approach was the practical approach. But the rebellion represented hope that things could be different, that tyranny didn't have to be permanent, that ordinary people could fight back and win. Han joining the rebellion was an act of faith in the possibility of change. It was him betting against cynicism. When the rebellion won and became the new republic, it should have vindicated Han's choice. Instead, it complicated things. The cause he'd fought for became an institution with bureaucracy and politics. The clear lines between good and evil blurred. Victory was messy in ways war never was. The rise of the First Order proved that evil wasn't defeated permanently at Endor. It could return, reorganize, rebuild. The cycle could continue endlessly. That realization was crushing for people who'd sacrificed everything for victory. Han responded by running. Leia responded by fighting again. Neither was wrong. Han Solo's legacy in the Resistance came through the people he'd trained and inspired. Pilots who learned from his tactics. Soldiers who'd served under his command. Smugglers who'd worked with him and been convinced to join the cause. His influence rippled through the organization. Poe Dameron, the Resistance's best pilot, flew with Han's swagger and confidence. He'd learned from studying Han's techniques. Finn's courage in defecting from the First Order was strengthened by meeting Han. Rey's determination to fight rather than run was shaped by Han's example in the days before he died. The dead can inspire the living in ways they never managed while alive. Han Solo became a legend after his death, a symbol of heroism that motivated the Resistance through its darkest hours. His sacrifice mattered not just for what he attempted, but for what it represented. The Millennium Falcon flying into battle at Exegol in the final conflict against Palpatine carried Han's spirit. Lando piloted it, having taken the ship from Chewbacca, who was co-piloting. The two old friends who'd known Han best flew his ship in the ultimate battle. It was poetic symmetry. Examining Han's moral evolution shows a consistent pattern. He started selfish and became selfless gradually. Each act of heroism made the next one easier. Each time he chose others over himself, he reinforced new patterns of behavior. The transformation wasn't magical or instantaneous. It was the result of consistent choices over decades. This is what makes Han Solo's arc so compelling. He proved that people can change, that your past doesn't have to define your future, that who you become is more important than who you were. The orphan from Corellia became a general and a hero, not through destiny, but through choosing to be better. The parallel between Han's journey and Rey's is striking. Both started as nobodies from nowhere. Both had mechanical skills and piloting instincts. Both were abandoned by their families. Both survived through cunning and determination. Rey represented what Han could have become if he'd met the right people earlier. Han saw that parallel too. That's why he offered Rey a job on the Falcon. Why he trusted her with his ship. Why he tried to guide her. He was paying forward the kindness that Ben Kenobi and Luke had shown him decades earlier. The cycle of mentorship and inspiration continuing. The relationship between Han and Finn was equally important. Finn was a stormtrooper who'd defected, who'd rejected everything he'd been raised to believe. Han understood that kind of fundamental reinvention. He'd done the same thing, choosing to be more than the criminal the galaxy expected him to be. Han didn't judge Finn's past, didn't hold his stormtrooper service against him. Instead, he saw Finn's courage in deserting, in choosing conscience over orders. That recognition validated Finn's choice, strengthened his resolve. Han Solo's acceptance helped Finn become the hero he was capable of being. The theme of found family runs throughout Han's story. He had no biological family worth mentioning, but he built a family from the people he met along the way. Chewbacca became his brother, Luke became his best friend, Leia became his wife. Lando, despite their complicated history, became family too. This found family gave Han something he'd never had growing up: belonging. A place where he was valued not for his utility but for himself. People who would risk their lives for him, not because they owed him, but because they loved him. It transformed him in ways he couldn't have anticipated. When that family fractured after Ben's fall, Han lost his anchor. The belonging he'd built so carefully dissolved. He tried to return to his old life, to the freedom he'd valued before meeting Luke and Leia. But it rang hollow. He'd been changed too much to go back. The tragedy of Han Solo is that he achieved everything he'd dreamed of as a young smuggler. He became the best pilot in the galaxy. He owned the fastest ship. He married a princess. He became a legend. And then he lost it all not to the Empire, but to his own son's choices. There's no villain to blame for Han's ultimate tragedy. The Empire was defeated. Darth Vader was dead. The war was won. But Ben's fall to darkness was something Han couldn't shoot his way out of, couldn't outfly, couldn't clever his way around. It was a problem that required emotional tools Han had never fully developed. Han's final words to Ben were, "I know." The same words he'd said to Leia in Carbonite. But the context was different. The meaning transformed. He was telling Ben that he knew his son was torn apart, that he understood the conflict. It was empathy in the moment Han needed it most. The fact that those words weren't enough to save Ben in that moment doesn't diminish their importance. They planted seeds. They reminded Ben that his father had tried to understand him, had tried to help. Those seeds grew in the year after Han's death, eventually bearing fruit in Ben's redemption. Han Solo's story asks profound questions about the nature of heroism. Do heroes need to be pure? Do they need to be selfless from the start? Do their past crimes disqualify them from heroism? Han's life suggests that heroism is about growth, about becoming better than you were. He wasn't always brave. He ran from fights he could have won. He abandoned the rebels at Yavin before changing his mind. He prioritized money over morals for years. He made countless mistakes as a husband and father. He died failing to save his son. By many measures, he was flawed throughout his life, but he kept trying, kept showing up, kept making the hard choice, eventually, even when the easy choice was available. That persistence, that refusal to stop trying, even after repeated failures, defines his heroism more than any single act of courage. The contrast between Han Solo and Kylo Ren is deliberate and painful. Han built himself up from nothing through audacity and skill. Ben was given everything and threw it away. Han learned to value connection. Ben rejected connection to pursue power. Han died trying to save his son. Ben killed his father to prove his commitment to darkness. But both were shaped by abandonment and fear. Han's childhood abandonment made him afraid of commitment. Ben's abandonment to Luke's training made him afraid of rejection. They responded to similar traumas in opposite ways. Han opened himself to love despite the risk. Ben closed himself off to avoid pain. The redemption of Ben Solo vindicated Han's final choice. His attempt to save his son wasn't futile, even though it seemed to fail. The love Han showed in that moment, the forgiveness he offered, the faith that Ben could change, all of it mattered. Heroism doesn't always succeed immediately, but it ripples forward through time. Han Solo's relationship with authority figures is consistently antagonistic. He didn't respect authority for its own sake, only earned authority based on competence and character. This got him expelled from the Imperial Academy. It made him a difficult subordinate in the rebellion. It defined his entire approach to life. But this disrespect for unearned authority made him effective in unconventional situations. He could think outside military doctrine. He could make decisions that by-the-book commanders would never consider. His insubordination was actually an asset when creative solutions were required. The rebellion promoted him to general despite these tendencies because they recognized his value. They needed people who could break rules effectively. Han's ability to improvise, to make risky calls, to trust his instincts over regulations made him perfect for special operations. But it also meant he never fully fit into the military hierarchy, even at high rank. He took orders from Mon Mothma and Leia, but he questioned everything. He argued strategy. He proposed alternatives. He was the general who acted like a smuggler, because fundamentally, that's what he remained. The question of what Han Solo believed in is complex. He didn't believe in the Force initially. He was skeptical of religion and mysticism. He didn't believe in governments or institutions. So what motivated him after he joined the rebellion? He believed in people, specific people. Luke, who represented hope and goodness. Leia, who represented strength and determination. Chewbacca, who represented loyalty and friendship. Han's idealism wasn't about abstract concepts. It was about protecting and supporting the individuals he cared about. This personal approach to heroism made him relatable. Most people don't risk their lives for abstract principles. They do it for family, for friends, for the people they love. Han's motivation was deeply human and understandable. He fought not for the rebellion, but for the rebels he knew personally. Over time, those personal connections expanded into something larger. Protecting Luke meant protecting all the pilots who flew with Luke. Supporting Leia meant supporting the government she was building. Loyalty to friends became commitment to their cause. The personal became political naturally. Han's piloting abilities deserve deeper examination. He wasn't force-sensitive, but he had instincts that bordered on precognition. He could feel when something was wrong with the Falcon. He could anticipate enemies' moves. He could navigate impossible situations through intuition. Some fans theorize Han was actually force-sensitive but untrained and unaware. His incredible luck, his impossible escapes, his perfect timing all suggest Force guidance. But the more interesting interpretation is that Han was simply that skilled, that experienced, that naturally gifted. Making Han purely mundane makes his achievements more impressive. If he succeeded through Force sensitivity, his heroism becomes less exceptional. But if he succeeded through skill, practice, and courage alone, then his achievements inspire. They suggest that dedication and natural talent can rival mystical powers. The Millennium Falcon's modifications reflected Han's personality perfectly. The ship was fast, maneuverable, heavily armed, and perpetually breaking down. It required constant maintenance and intimate knowledge of its quirks. It was temperamental, unreliable, and absolutely irreplaceable. Han knew every inch of that ship, every shortcut, every workaround, every trick to coax more power from systems that shouldn't work. The Falcon responded to Han in ways it wouldn't for other pilots. That relationship between pilot and ship was almost mystical, despite having nothing to do with the Force. When Rey flew the Falcon with Han's level of skill immediately, it suggested either Force-enhanced piloting or a natural gift equal to Han's. Either way, Han recognized that gift. He saw himself in her flying. That recognition created their bond as much as any conversation. The loss of the Falcon to various parties after Ben's fall symbolized Han's psychological state. The ship was his identity, his home, his last connection to his glory days. Losing it repeatedly showed how far he'd fallen, how little control he had over his own life anymore. Stealing the Falcon back each time was Han asserting that he still mattered, that he could still pull off the impossible. But the fact that he kept losing it showed that assertion was increasingly hollow. He was going through the motions of being Han Solo without the substance that had made him legendary. The question of Han Solo's intelligence is interesting. He was clearly smart, but not in academic ways. He had street smarts, practical knowledge, social intelligence. He could read people, predict behavior, manipulate situations. He could calculate vectors and odds in his head while under fire. But he never showed interest in philosophy or abstract thinking. He was concrete, practical, focused on immediate problems. When others debated the nature of the Force or discussed political philosophy, Han tuned out. He cared about what worked, not why it worked. This practical intelligence served him well. He didn't get bogged down in overthinking. He made decisions quickly based on available information and moved on. In crisis situations, this decisiveness was crucial. While others hesitated, Han acted. But it also limited him in some ways. He struggled with emotional complexity. He couldn't articulate his feelings well. He avoided deep conversations about meaning and purpose. His intelligence was tactical rather than strategic, immediate rather than long-term. The contrast between Han and Leia's intelligence types created productive tension. She thought strategically, planned long-term, considered political implications. He thought tactically, improvised constantly, focused on immediate survival. Together, they covered each other's blind spots. Han's humor was his psychological defense mechanism. When situations got desperate, he made jokes. When emotions ran high, he deflected with sarcasm. When confronted with uncomfortable truths, he changed the subject with wisecracks. It was protective armor that kept him from being vulnerable. But that armor also created distance. People couldn't always tell when Han was serious versus when he was joking. His constant deflection made genuine connection difficult. Leia had to learn to hear what Han meant beneath what he said. Luke had to learn when Han's cynicism was real versus performative. As Han matured, the armor thinned. He became more willing to be sincere, to express genuine emotion, to let people see his vulnerability. The journey from "I know" to trying to reach Ben on Starkiller Base showed enormous emotional growth over the decades. The relationship between Han and Lando deserves more attention than it often gets. They were rivals and friends simultaneously. Competition mixed with genuine affection. They'd conned each other, saved each other, betrayed each other, and forgiven each other repeatedly. Lando's betrayal on Bespin should have ended their friendship permanently. He'd sold Han to Vader, directly causing Han's carbonite freezing. But Lando had been coerced, had tried to minimize damage, and had ultimately helped rescue Han. The friendship survived because both understood the complications of surviving in a corrupt galaxy. When Lando joined the rebellion after Cloud City, he did so partly from guilt over betraying Han, but also because Han had shown him that there were things worth fighting for beyond profit and safety. Han's transformation inspired Lando's transformation. The smuggler saved the gambler by example. Years later, both men were in their 60s and still fighting. Han went to Starkiller Base. Lando eventually came out of retirement to help the resistance at Exegol. The boys who'd competed over Sabbatsy games and who could fly faster had become old men still trying to save the galaxy. Han Solo's impact on galactic history cannot be overstated. Without him, Luke dies at Yavin and the Death Star destroys the rebellion. Without him, the shield generator on Endor doesn't fall and the second Death Star survives. Without him, Ben Solo might never have returned to the light. But his impact went beyond specific battles. He proved that ordinary people could be heroes. He showed that your origins don't determine your destiny. He demonstrated that cynics could become idealists, that smugglers could become generals, that selfish people could learn to sacrifice for others. The galaxy remembered Han Solo, not just for his military victories, but for what he represented, the possibility of change, the power of showing up when it matters, the importance of loyalty and friendship. These intangible legacies influenced countless people across the galaxy. Young pilots joined the rebellion because they'd heard stories of Han Solo making the Kessel Run in 12 parsecs. Deserters from the Empire found courage in the story of a smuggler who became a hero. Cynics reconsidered their worldview when confronted with evidence that caring about something bigger than yourself could actually work. The story of Han Solo challenges the notion that heroes must be pure or perfect. He wasn't pure. He'd done questionable things for money. He'd worked for criminal organizations. He'd killed people. His past was murky at best. But he became a hero anyway, by choosing better actions going forward. This suggests that redemption is available to anyone willing to change. That past mistakes don't have to define you permanently. That you can become someone different through consistent choice and action. It's a hopeful message in a galaxy that often felt deterministic. The contrast between Han's death and Leia's death is revealing. Han died violently, betrayed by his son, falling into an abyss. Leia died peacefully, reaching out through the Force to save her son, succeeding where Han had failed. But both deaths served the same purpose, trying to bring Ben home. Han's death planted seeds of doubt in Kylo Ren. Leia's death made those seeds grow. Together, their sacrifices redeemed their son. Neither succeeded alone, but together they accomplished what seemed impossible. Even in death, they were still partners, still working toward the same goal. The vision of Han that Ben saw after Leia died was the culmination of everything Han had tried to teach his son. That it's never too late to change. That love matters more than power. That choosing the light takes more strength than surrendering to darkness. These lessons finally reached Ben when he was ready to hear them. Han Solo's legacy in the new generation carried through multiple characters. Rey inherited his piloting skills and his mechanical knowledge. Finn inherited his courage to desert from evil. Poe inherited his tactical brilliance and his swagger. Ben eventually inherited his capacity for redemption. The Millennium Falcon continued flying after Han's death, piloted by those he'd influenced. Rey took it on missions. Chewbacca maintained it. Lando flew it into the final battle. The ship outlived its captain but carried his spirit. Every improvised repair, every impossible maneuver, every narrow escape echoed Han's influence. Physical objects carrying emotional weight is a recurring theme in Star Wars, and the Falcon is the ultimate example. It wasn't just transportation, it was home, identity, legacy. When Rey said she had a ship at the end of The Rise of Skywalker, she was claiming more than a vessel. She was claiming connection to Han's legacy. The question of whether Han died happy is worth considering. He died trying to save his son, which was the most important thing in his life at that moment. He died believing he'd failed. But he also died doing something heroic, something selfless, something that mattered. By his own evolving standards, it was a good death. Han wouldn't have wanted to die of old age in a comfortable bed. That wasn't who he was. He lived dangerously and died dangerously. There's a consistency there, a fitting end for someone who'd spent his whole life taking risks. The only tragedy was that the risk didn't pay off in the moment. But risks can pay off across time rather than immediately. Han's risk paid off a year later when Ben was redeemed. The investment in his son, the faith that Ben could change, the willingness to die trying to reach him, all of it mattered, even though Han never knew it succeeded. The parallel between Han shooting Greedo first in the cantina and not shooting first on Starkiller Base shows his transformation. Young Han shot threats preemptively. Old Han reached out to threats with love and hope. Both approaches were authentic to who he was at those times in his life. Some fans criticize Han for not shooting Kylo Ren on Starkiller Base, for approaching unarmed, for giving Ben a chance to kill him. But that criticism misses the point. Han had to try to reach his son without violence. Shooting Ben would have been admitting defeat, admitting Ben was beyond saving. Han refused to believe that. The choice to approach unarmed was tactical in its way. Han believed the only chance of reaching Ben was through vulnerability, through showing absolute trust and love. He calculated that weapons would doom the attempt before it started. He was probably right, even though it killed him. Han Solo's story is ultimately about hope. Hope that people can change. Hope that the galaxy can be better. Hope that ordinary people can do extraordinary things. Hope that love matters even when everything suggests it doesn't. Hope that choosing to care is worthwhile even when it hurts. He started without hope, surviving day to day on the streets of Corellia. He built a life on cynicism and self-preservation. But gradually, imperceptibly, he started hoping for things. Hoping to escape. Hoping to find belonging. Hoping to protect the people he loved. Hoping his son could be saved. That hope made him vulnerable. It hurt him repeatedly. It led to his death. But it also made his life meaningful in ways that pure survival never could have. The pain and the meaning were inseparable. You can't have one without the other. The galaxy is better because Han Solo existed. Not just because of the battles he won or the enemies he defeated, but because he showed people what was possible. That you could start with nothing and become someone. That you could change your nature through choice. That cynics could become heroes. When Rey introduced herself as Rey Skywalker at the end of The Rise of Skywalker, she was honoring Luke and Leia, but she was also honoring Han, the man who'd shown her kindness, the man who'd offered her a place, the man who died trying to save his son. She carried his legacy forward into whatever future the galaxy would build. The Millennium Falcon flying off at the end with Rey at the controls was poetic symmetry. The ship that had carried Han Solo from smuggler to hero now carried a new generation of heroes. The modifications Han made, the repairs he improvised, the personality he'd given the ship, all of it continued serving the cause of freedom. Chewbacca, who'd known Han longest and loved him most deeply, kept flying, kept fighting, kept living, because that's what Han would have wanted. The life debt had never been about obligation. It had been about love. That love survived Han's death and motivated everything Chewie did afterward. The story of Han Solo teaches us that transformation is possible at any age. He was in his 30s when he truly became a hero at Yavin. In his 50s when he became a father. In his 60s when he made his final sacrifice. He kept growing, kept changing, kept becoming more than he'd been. Age didn't stop his evolution. It also teaches that heroism isn't about perfection. Han made mistakes constantly. He failed often. He said the wrong thing, made bad calls, hurt the people he loved. But he kept trying, kept showing up, kept choosing to be better. That persistence mattered more than any individual success or failure. The relationship between effort and outcome is complex in Han's story. He tried to save Ben and failed. He tried to pay off Jabba and ended up frozen in carbonite. He tried to build a peaceful life and watched it crumble. By outcome measures, he failed at many of his most important goals. But the trying mattered. The effort shaped who he became. The failures taught him lessons. The pain deepened his capacity for empathy. Every attempt, successful or not, moved him incrementally toward being the person he was capable of becoming. The journey was the point, not the destination. If Han Solo's ghost could speak to the galaxy that survived him, what would he say? Probably something sarcastic. But beneath the wisecracks, he'd want people to know that everyone's redeemable, that your past doesn't have to be your future, that showing up for the people you love is what matters, that it's never too late to become the hero of your own story. He'd tell young people from nothing that they can become something. He'd tell cynics that caring is worth the pain. He'd tell people afraid of commitment that love is scary but essential. He'd tell everyone that flying fast and shooting straight helps. But loyalty and courage matter more. The legend of Han Solo grew after his death. Stories exaggerated his exploits, made the Kessel Run even more impressive, added fictional adventures to his real ones, turned the man into a myth. But the man was impressive enough without embellishment. He really did make the Kessel Run in 12 parsecs. He really did save Luke at the Battle of Yavin. He really did survive carbonite freezing. He really did lead the Endor mission. He really did sacrifice himself trying to save his son. The truth was legendary without any need for fiction. The greatest testament to Han Solo's impact is visible in the people he influenced. Rey became a Jedi and carried his practical approach to problems. Finn became a leader and carried his courage to make hard choices. Poe became a general and carried his tactical creativity. Ben returned to the light, carrying his father's capacity for redemption. Each of them was better because they'd known Han Solo. Each of them carried forward pieces of his legacy. The orphan from Corellia, who thought he'd die alone instead, lived on through the people he'd touched. His found family became his legacy, spreading his influence across the galaxy. In the end, the story of Han Solo is the story all of us are telling. The story of trying to be better than we were yesterday, of making mistakes and learning from them, of loving people despite the risk, of showing up when it matters, even when we're scared, of becoming heroes not through destiny, but through choice. Han Solo proved that the galaxy doesn't need chosen ones or prophecies to create heroes. It just needs people willing to care about something bigger than themselves, people willing to take risks for others, people willing to keep trying even after they fail, people willing to believe that tomorrow can be better than today. That scruffy-looking nerf herder from Corellia, who only cared about money and his ship when we first met him, became one of the greatest heroes the galaxy ever knew. Not because he was special, but because he chose to be. And that choice, repeated across decades, changed everything. If you made it this far, thank you for taking this journey with me through the life of Han Solo. If you enjoyed this exploration of Star Wars' most beloved scoundrel, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the characters and stories that make these universes so compelling. Drop a comment below and let me know your favorite Han Solo moment, or what other Star Wars characters you'd like us to explore next. Until next time, may the Force be with you, and remember, never tell me the odds. Thanks for watching.